Good day everyone, I'm Alessandro Canegari from the Architecture and Design Department of Genoa University, and I'm going to share with you some ideas about the act of selecting and collecting and about their consequences on architectural identity. For most, please excuse the fact that I'm not able to be there with you in person due to time constraints and overlapping commitments. Anyway, have you ever thought about the huge power hid in the ordinary act of selecting? Every day, we all spend so much time selecting and sorting conceptual or material identities, so much so that we often do not have any awareness of having done such a mountain classification works, because the large part of it is tacit. In fact, leaving aside for a moment the exception with the taxonomy that has been characterized in the Western history, we could say that the act of selecting is inherent in human nature.
In particular, getting how we categorize is the basis of any other understanding of how our mind functions, the main key to an understanding of what makes us human, as language does, providing a specific access to any worldviews and its shared realities. Since in their language structure, having noun is marked as a component of a specific class, the Girbas language was noted by Lekov for its division into four different semantic lines corresponding to class mirroring their habits and their feeding regime, primarily based on fruits and vegetables, as shown. So, in front of their partition of reality, it's somewhat difficult for a Westerner not to be struck by problem of consistency, precisely like Foucault in front of the Chinese Encyclopedia of Borges. Of course, the Girbal categories are closer than ours to an intuitive way of feeling and thinking, showing the gap produced by the distance between Aristotle's dichotomy and the way in which our mind puts in order what populates our words. Strictly speaking, the Aristotelian logic precludes any form of vagueness typical of human linguistic and mental processes, which instead would reveal themselves as bearer of wealth. This is a crucial point for our argument about the power of the maker of an ontology. Indeed, we must not forget how man is cognitively brought to keep heterogeneous objects together through analogical and nuanced criteria, mainly based on simile, metaphor, and metonymy, tropes with high cognitive value as betrayed by our daily language. What matters here is how these nuanced criteria are close and others to the mind of who make the selection, the real protagonist hidden behind every kind of collection. What I mean is that every collection presumes a mind in its background. That mind implements and works on that array of things mainly using just those analogical criteria. Firstly, this is important because what that mind could define becomes possible and perhaps even real under certain conditions and at certain times. That's the point. Besides, this closeness to cognitive processes show how the act of collecting is based on an intimate gesture. The objects we want to save are often linked by a idiosyncratical logic that sometimes we are not able to reveal because at the action level we drastically simplify things, permitting our mind to choose among various alternatives. Even though the selection can happen under strictly scientific declared criteria, that intimate gesture acting in the background drives each choice of the collector as much those of the editor of an anthology. The positivist today dwelling within us is ready to refuse such a logic. However, at the origin of every collection, such as an anthology or a museum, there's a treasure, semaphore object or writings. The logic conducting them in a unicum, making them a collection, is entirely arbitrary, and their belonging to that set is able to lift them from their usual function or their single meaning, giving them a specific and distinct value in that context. The modern man rejects any form of superior order, seeking refuge into anthology, archives, and museum as devices for organizing the knowledge, echoing his awareness of the power of those devices, not only to manage knowledge, but as tools to control memory and improve culture, up to produce the reality in the postmodern era. In this light, it's easy to understand both our pressing fear of losing the memory and our inner drive for archiving, today supported by information technology that discourage the selection and satisfy our ability to accumulate. The potential of those devices, together with the consciousness and the complexity of reality, now made by an unlimited number of individual horizons, clarifies how the symbol of our age is a sort of ideal warehouse from which to incessantly draw ideas, concepts, and images. After being extracted from their original context, these elements are assembled as a new works. This means that we tacitly admit the ontological power to those who make this come true. This trend is of course widely part of the architectural way of working since ancient times. However, in the postmodern era, this practice goes beyond shapes involving the discipline itself, both at the theoretical level and at the critical one, and making the ontology one of the essential tools of that involvement. For this reason, it is necessary to understand how the selection of the past now allows the producing of the new and sometimes even of the reality. This means that the real power of the editor of an anthology lies precisely in the authority of choice and recombination of a collection of texts, defining original groups with internal rules from which more relationships emerge than the editor himself could preview determine. In an image not far from berry picking in the woods lies the etymology of the term anthology, grounded as it is in the gathering of flower, the flower of verse. Thus, from delightful collection of poems, the anthology have become oriented collections of pieces, perfect for spreading ideas, for directing the disciplines and the propaganda. Nevertheless, it does not matter if you collect flowers, berries, or poems. What really matters is that the frequent adoption of the same serendipitous way of managing to collect those writings that can determine if something is a part of a given set, laying down its rules and defining its interaction options, and above all, its very identity. In fact, this is not only allows the editor of an anthology to provide the background or the genealogy of which a discipline is founded, supply autonomy to the discipline, but it can ever define a new one, forming in an extensional way. Thus, at the root of every anthology, there is an ontology, meaning that the editor acts of selection is somehow the founding of a word. Especially, this occurs with a new awareness in the postmodern horizon. Here, thanks to the quotational game, it is possible to produce the original from the known, acting on a substratum of knowledge presupposed among those who are the recipients of the work, giving a fresh light to the object, as pointed out by Gardner. The success of many architectural works, say an anthology, is based on this dynamic, especially in the early and late postmodern period, such as Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture of 1966. That is say, is a sui generis anthology where a theoretical goal is reached through a motley collection of juxtaposes famous example. Every object is those pages from Roma ruins to Can experimental projects, from Rome Junction to the Barocco details, gain new value and appear in original guise and perspective. In the context of postmodern pluralism, the act of making the new can be admitted as war making, and this is the correct way to express all the authority of those who compile an anthology. In such a framework, the method of making the fresh from the known, employing juxtaposition, turns a bizarre surrealist art practice in a remarkable ontological instrument when applied with the methodological rigor of philosophy. We can find a turning point of this argument in Nelson Goodman's theoretical production of late 70s. In the book Ways of War Making, it is asserted that there is not a word, but many words, none of them all-encompassing, and above all, every one of them having the same degree of reality. Of course, this is possible only under strict conditions, to guarantee accurate control and avoid that anything goes. In particular, here, it is essential to notice two main pillars of his theory, crucial for bestowing ontological dignity to the act of making an ontology. First of all, it is essential to notice how in Goodman's system word making consists of taking apart and putting together, often conjointly, composing wholes, combining features into complexes, and making connections. Furthermore, he clarifies how the words are not made from nothing after all, but from other words, namely word making, as we know, it always starts from words already on hand. The making is a remaking. Although this is sufficient for showing us the ontological dignity of ontologies, Goodman specifies how even a simple variation of accent delineates different words starting from the same material, opening, in our case, a further multiplication of their potential. This makes clear what potential one who traces an enclosure has in defining a set, as the history of architecture has shown us many times. It is enough to think how the selection made by Johnson and Hitchcock in 1932 for their exhibition codified international style. In short, a precise selection of texts established a world of rules, ontologizing them, or rather, in our case, codifying a new architecture, meaning as a discipline. That means that every ontology, paradoxically, has the power to define its own architecture. Thus, in this light, we could almost potentially trace new architectures ad libitum. An instrument provided with this power hardly tends to get outdated, sometimes having a social effect. In the last century, architects have resorted to such a strategy several times, with different awareness since the first Siam at La Sarah in 1928 and probably even before that. Precisely from the success of that declaration, the slogan and the exclusionary behavior of the pioneers of modern architecture succeeded in making a void, opposing the past with new values and new way of understanding dwellings, art, the world, and life. Particular, according to the political scientist Mill, it is possible to underline how the masters of modern architecture, under the mask of thaumaturgical agents of the future, concealed the same theoretical scheme of their immediate predecessors, giving an example of how to make the new from a nothing. Thanks to the mask, they have slowly dismantled an unbroken tradition and ontology that lasted for a long time. After the Second World War, the wishes of cultural reconstruction tainted the architectural debates following the increasing awareness of the complexity which expanded in scientific and philosophical environments. This perception made tight the emptiness and the out black or white climate of the pioneers, as declared by Venturi in his Gentle Manifesto of 1966. The emptiness caused by this orthodoxy began to fill up with the new theoretical reconstruction more than ever with the complicity of both language and philosophy. Thus, architecture, for centuries based on eminently constructive fact, has to deal with what was previously ascribed to other disciplines.
Now, in the emptiness of postmodernity, without the rules and without the possibility of writing an architectural treatise, all that remains is to draw the rules of the game from individual opinions, from partial point of view, collecting text. Out of metaphor, anthology became the way to construct the many worlds of postmodern architecture, filling the vast gap caused by the avant-garde's destructive ontology. The meeting of this powerful text with the authority of war-making, offered by philosophy, with the help of linguistics and the latest text mining technology, a new scenario for the discipline unfolds. In this light, every ontology and every possible set of that ocean of papers turn into a gold mine, becoming an analytical corpus for the text mining software. The paper are the pivots on which it is possible to ground every possible ontology, concurrently grounding an ontology.
On the other hand, anthologies can become the source for the extraction of the core topic by means of cluster analysis of their content, focusing on the recurrent concept and thought chains contained underlying the connection and their weight on the entire collection.
If, as we said, every group of texts has the chance to define a word, or rather its own version of the discipline, then a deep study of them could permit to go inside the thought nourishing each of those words. As an instrument to explore parallel path in architecture through its very words, anthology becomes a new way of understanding architecture from within, opening a new season of self-reflection for the discipline, unfolding as an instrument for the future. Thank you.
Now? Okay, hello. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. My name is Marcos Pantaleon, and the title of my essay is Anthology as Collection, Althusser versus Benjamin. I have to apologize in advance because my English is not very good, but I have to try to speak slowly and pronounce as better I can. Okay, with this lecture, I have the intention to briefly explore the possibilities of the Benjaminian concept of collection as an alternative device to that of anthology. To achieve this goal, I will explain what could be the main deficiencies of the use of anthology in the current panorama of architectural theory, and why Benjamin's concept of collection could be useful to solve them. So the main question to address could be, is anthology an obsolete instrument for current times, or does it contain some kind of purpose? To address this question, I have analyzed one of the best known and most representative anthologies of this kind, the compilation of texts published by Michael Hayes in 1998, entitled Architecture Theory since 1968. To carry out this analysis, I have leaned on the work of two authors. On the one hand, on Sylvia Lavin's essay, Theory into History, or The Will to Anthology, published in 1999. And on the other hand, in some of the ideas that Walter Benjamin developed in works such as Edward Fuchs' Collector and Historian, or on the concept of history. To explain why anthologies could be obsolete instruments, I will explain both the concept of history and the concept of theory on which they are based. Finally, I will comment why the supposed obsolescence of anthologies could be of great value if anthology is considered as collection, on the concept of history. In one of the paragraphs of the introduction to Hayes' anthology, we can read the following statement, I quote, "There are other criteria mentioned in no particular order that guide the selection for this anthology. Though I believe that the most important texts of architecture theory are included here, I have not tried to reproduce the most used text or anthologize history as it really happened. Rather, I have rationally reconstructed the history of architecture theory in an attempt to produce, as Luis Althusser recommended, the concept of that history, which is a quite different matter. Then we could infer that Hayes' anthology is an attempt to produce the concept of the history of architecture theory since 1968, and that Luis Althusser is the key figure to understand what it means to produce a concept of history. What this anthology is not, history as it really happened, is apparently pointing to Leopold von Ranke, one of the main figures of 19th century historicism, who considered that the task of the historian was precisely, I quote, to show what actually happened. This statement is obvious and simple, but it pretended to be a challenge to the philosophies of history of the first half of the 19th century, particularly Hegel's philosophy of history. Ranke didn't believe that history could be circumscribed by a concept. I quote, "My understanding of leading ideas is simply that they are the dominant tendencies in each century. These tendencies, however, can only be described. They cannot, in the last resort, be summed up in a concept." End of quote. So from Ranke's point of view, we can appreciate a similarity between Hegel and Antusa. However, if Hegel considers historical knowledge as an absolute knowledge, relatively easy to obtain as a rational reading of facts, rationally oriented to an ultimate goal, in Althusser, knowledge is a practice. It's not a matter of recognizing it as if it were something given, as historians consider, because, I quote, "Like any concept, it is never given immediately. It is never readable in visible reality. This concept, like any concept, must be produced, constructed." End of quote. So if the materialist historian wants to account for the past, he must introduce into it a theoretical production that is not in the historical course. As Althusser states, I quote, "The knowledge of history is not historical, just as the knowledge of sugar is not sugary." So what is the relation between Althusser and Benjamin? Despite their many differences, both Althusser and Benjamin took as their point of departure the questioning of the concept of history commonly accepted in orthodox Marxism. Both insisted on the need to produce a new concept of history that would break with the dominant and fetishist idea of history as continuous and homogeneous linearity. To achieve this goal, both reinterpreted Marx's works, focusing attention on Hegel's influence on Marx. But although both Althusser and Benjamin had similar intention when they developed the critical analysis of history, they achieved completely different results. We should also add that the impact of Walter Benjamin's writing on architectural theory, especially of his philosophy of history, is broad since the 1970s. So his influence coincides with the historical period covered by Hayes' anthology. If we compare it from a statistical point of view the impact that Althusser and Benjamin have had on the authors compiled in His Anthology, we can see that Benjamin's influence on the architecture theory of that period is at least as important as Althusser's, if not greater. Once the relationship between His Anthology and Benjamin's concept of history is established, we will now explore the relationship between Lavin and Benjamin. From the very beginning of the reading of Lavin's essay, I found a correspondence between Lavin's approach to history and that of Walter Benjamin, particularly when it comes to analyzing the problem of how history can be interpreted, represented, or conceptualized, and how the different criteria and techniques that can be used to carry out this task modify the reception conditions, and therefore our own understanding of the past. In this way, I established a close relationship between Lavin's critical analysis of anthologies and Benjamin's critical analysis of both historicism and historical materialism. I will give some examples of this relationship. At the beginning of her essay, Sylvia Lavin states that, I quote, "While as a group these volumes describe architectural upheaval, they perform a contradictory function as well. Anthologies, compendia, and other such collections establish completion and lend stability to an otherwise promiscuous body of material. The techniques of cataloging and classification used by these volumes provide both order and closure," end of quote. In the criticism of historicism that Benjamin develops in his essay, Edward Fuchs, Collector and Historian, instead of stability, he talks of unease. I quote, "That state of unease which marks the beginning of any consideration of history worthy of being called dialectical. Unease over the provocation to the researcher, who must abandon the calm, contemplative attitude toward his object in order to become conscious of the critical constellation in which precisely this fragment of the past finds itself with precisely this present." End of quote. This statement recalls Nietzsche's words that Benjamin chose to head the 12 theses of his last work on the concept of history. I quote, "We need history, but not the way a spoiled loafer in the garden of knowledge needs it." End of quote. Benjamin follows, in his own way, the path traced by Nietzsche in his fight to that kind of historicism that overwhelmed action under the weight of a cultural overdose. The character of historicism that is, according to Benjamin, to be rejected is very clear. It is the accumulating conception of history in 19th century Germany as a coherent linear process, which is stated philosophically by Hegel and then developed into the academic historiographic industries of Ranke, Droysen, Mommsen, and Treitschke, among others. Benjamin calls the narrative principle of this kind a history, an epic one. It is a history of once upon a time, he says, of an aestheticized, totalized past. The historian who contemplates this past, and contemplation is the relevant mode of thought, is thus able at once to reify a perfect picture of an autonomous past era, and at the same time to infuse that past era into a linear totality that ultimately produces and justifies the present. The antidote to these historicisms is historical materialism, but defined by Benjamin in a highly idiosyncratic manner, toward which the authentic persona of Edward Fuchs is appropriated. So can we establish some kind of correspondence between the way in which history was represented by historicists at the end of the 19th century and the way in which anthologies conceptualized the history of post-war architecture theory at the end of the 20th century? To try to find a reason that could explain this surprising similarity between the effects provoked by historicists and those provoked by anthologies, we will point out one of the main differences between Althusser and Benjamin, the influence that Nietzsche had in both thinkers. In spite of Althusser was basically of the same generation as Foucault and Derrida, he explicitly and vehemently rejected Nietzsche and Heidegger's criticism of science and political progress. Instead, Althusser constantly argued that scientific knowledge is objective and real, and that practical knowledge of objective political and cultural realities is also knowable. Now, let us briefly explain why the dialectical image could be an alternative to this suprahistorical perspective that is needed to produce a concept of history. In his work on the concept of history, there is not a discursive explanation about the past, but rather an image in its place. Benjamin seeks to give up conceptual games of philosophy and transform the concepts into images. To capture the movement of history, the flow must stop. But unlike Althusser's suprahistorical perspective, the temporal suspension produced by the dialectical image is not a timeless point, but the interweaving of time that occurs between the past and the present in a moment of danger. In the sixth thesis of his work on the concept of history, Benjamin states, "To articulate the past historically doesn't mean to recognize it the way it really was," as Ranke said. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. The first part of the quote, what is concept of history is not, is clearly related with Hegel's intention. It is in the second part where we can appreciate the main difference. Instead, to produce a concept of history, what Benjamin proposes is to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. The danger to which Benjamin refers is that which ruins the tradition of becoming a tool of the ruling classes. And that is why, in every era, the attempt must be made anew to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to overpower it. And the concept of theory. After referring what could be the problems of the concept of history, in which anthologies are based, we are going to address the problems of the concept of theory. In her essay, Lavin declares, I quote, "Anthologies are thus the literary merger of museums and psychotherapeutic counselors at trauma sites, historize and thus complete a modernist project that was conceived to be always ongoing," end of quote. After relating anthologies with historicists, we can understand better why she compared anthologies with museums. But the criteria which drives the selection of the fragments which configure an anthology of this kind is driven for more reasons than a question of beauty or antiquarian will to accumulate fragments of the past. If not, why does Lavin associate this need to historize implicit in anthologies with a therapeutic function? To address this question, Lavin continues by explaining that anthologies, I quote, transfigure an important 18th century strategy for deploying history and criticality through the technique of collecting text. This strategy, in which abstract ideas generated by the philosophers are set into motion by publication to shape events, may well describe the typical role assigned to theory in schools of architecture. Post-war theory, as instrumentalized by these recent anthologies, is generally understood as a mobilization of criticality toward a revolution in design practice. End of quote. This conception of architecture theory, based on, I quote, the Enlightenment model whereby philosophy produces revolution or theory produces design, is the opposite of that of Vitruvius or Blondel. Those writings reflect and articulate the common architectural practices of their times, rather than to have caused a fundamental change in the discipline. This fundamental inversion of the order in the relation between theory and practice is the reason why Ockman, Hayes, or Tschumi have said that there was no theory, properly speaking, in architecture before 1968. To shed some light on this matter, we are going to compare two statements in which Lavin and Benjamin seem to agree. Lavin recalls a quote by Roger Cartier to question this concept of theory capable of provoking a revolutionary architecture. I quote, "In affirming that it was the Enlightenment that produced the revolution, the classical interpretation perhaps inverses logical order. Should we not consider instead that it was the revolution that invented the Enlightenment by attempting to root its legitimacy in a corpus of texts and finding authors reconciled and united beyond their extreme differences? The revolutionaries constructed a continuity that was primarily a process of justification and a search for paternity." End of quote. In a very similar way, Benjamin points out, I quote, "This is also evident in Fuchs' work when he declares, in all its essentials, art, we can say architecture, is the idealized disguise of a given social situation. For it is an eternal law that every dominant political or social situation is forced to idealize itself in order to justify its existence ethically. So we can ask what if, as Roger Chartier suggests about French revolutionaries, that sequence of assumptions is a myth, and it is the trauma caused by changes in social and material conditions that creates not only revolutions in the science practice, but also the urgent need for build, in retrospect, a past, a tradition with which to legitimize themselves. Then this concept of theory, in which anthologies are based, could be just a justification similar to the one that, as Freud showed us, the conscious mind developed to justify the impulses of the unconscious, in order to reduce the uncertainty of the real and provide a feeling of control over a situation that we cannot manage. This conscious or unconscious instrumentalization of the past carried out by anthologies is what Lavin criticized. The way in which they saw the theory of post-war architectural theory in such a way that generates this lineage for the present. On the contrary, Benjamin proposed his particular interpretation of historical materialism, in which, I quote, "the materialist presentation of history leads the past to bring the present into a critical state." Commenting Hayes' intention to show the physiognomy of the architectural theory since 1968, that prevailing contours, Lavin said, I quote, "We see in Hayes the subsuming of at once deniable theoretical provocation to be critical within a newly formulated will to historize the theory of architecture," end of quote.
We can find certain traces of that historizing function in the words of Hayes when he confesses that he has rationally reconstructed the history of architecture theory. But if reason guides the choices of the architectural theorist in his desire to produce an appropriate concept of the history, it is passion, on the contrary, what guides the activity of the Benjaminian historian. I quote, "The collector's passion is a divining rod that turns him into a discoverer of new sources," end of quote. That divining rod, which the collector owns, reveals that the collector activity is guided by unconscious impulses. As Benjamin said, I quote, "Similar tendencies later led Fuchs to conceptions akin to psychoanalysis. He was the first to make them fruitful for aesthetics," end of quote. This divining rod led the collector to overcome that imperceptible necessity imposed by reason to look for therapeutic closure, which distorts whatever production of a concept of history. It is in this unconscious passion which guides the collector where Benjamin situated, I quote, "the point where Fuchs, the collector, taught Fuchs, the theoretician, to comprehend much that the times denied him." This holds true for Fuchs, and it explains why he felt compelled to oppose the spirit which prevailed in the museums under Wilhelm II. These museums were intent on possessing so-called showpieces. Certainly, say Fuchs, today's museums tend towards such a mode of collecting simply for reasons of space. But this doesn't change the fact that owing to this tendency, we are left with quite fragmentary notions of the culture of the past. We see the past in splendid holiday array, and only rarely in its mostly savvy working clothes. Can we apply this to the way in which anthologies show the past? Conclusion. So if we return to our initial question, is anthology an obsolete instrument for current times, or does it contain some kind of purpose? We could say that. On the one hand, one of the reasons why anthologies could be obsolete instruments is because they are based on a concept of history, that of Althusser, which shares with historians, although of course in a different manner, the belief in the possibility of establishing a suprahistorical perspective from which to contemplate and analyze the past, and thus be able to produce a concept of history. To overcome this still idealistic conception, what Benjamin proposes is not to produce a concept of history, but to take hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. That is, not a concept but an image. The dialectical image is what produces that anachronistic time, not timeless or suprahistorical, but interrupted, intertwined historical time, that could allow us to get in touch with the past not through reason but through experience. On the other hand, one of the reasons why anthologies could be obsolete instruments is because they are based on a concept of theory which is vulnerable to the unconscious need to justify the present. So the task of the historian should be not to build an intellectual image for the present, but to articulate the past in such a way that the present is put into a critical situation. If we transfer this to the field of the theory of architecture, we would say that the theoretician or historian's task would not be to retrospectively legitimize certain architectural practices, but to question their validity and thus open the architectural practice to new possibilities. Finally, if we take into account the revolutionary power that Benjamin, via surrealists, attributed to obsolete objects, it could be possible that the most important contribution of anthologies, more than its documentary or historiographic value, is precisely its obsolescence, what Labin could call its diagnostic function. In this way, the destructive task of the historian, if considered as allegorist, would not be to destroy the anthology, but to reveal the possible reasons for its obsolescence, or what is the same, not destroy the anthology, but its aura. Because it is precisely in the awareness of its obsolescence that anthology could achieve its true power. Then anthology loses its veil and becomes what it really is, a collection of fragments. The anthology as collection would then be valuable in two ways. On the one hand, by showing, with all the rigor and objectivity of the scientific document, an excellent selection of fragments of the past. On the other hand, by revealing, throughout its own obsolescence, the mythological foundation in which anthologies, and maybe architectural theory since 1968, seems to be founded. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Giacomo Pana from the Innsbruck University. First of all, thank you for having selected my paper. What I will do is trying to present an anthology I've been working on recently in the last month. Well, a never-ending process, apparently, but in the sense that I have used this occasion given to me by the editors of a magazine that is Vice Versa in order to somehow ask myself what is theory, how can be problematized today, and in order to do so, I've looked at somehow the ontologies of architectural theory. And quite curiously, while I was doing this process, the call for papers of this conference came up. So basically what I've been doing is like a student to basically ask myself some questions and trying to give some answers through the development of this work. So the first question, of course, would be, what is theory? Now, to simplify and to cut it really short, I would say that theory is basically the invention of concepts, in the sense that it's, rather than being the understanding of the reality of our world, it's more or less, I would say, at least in architecture, but probably also in science, is the invention of the world, which is to say that, of course, architects have used our world, have understood our world, but they've also somehow reinvented it. So Las Vegas is not what Venturi is saying, as New York is not what Rencolas is saying. They basically somehow use this city in order to reinvent architecture and the same content of these places they're studying it. At the same time, we have historians and theorists who do architectural design. So, for instance, these are Colin Rowe on the right, yes, and Jeffrey Kippen is on the right, who are working on, let's say, the concept of figure ground in different times and different ways, but yet we see how theory somehow also, theoreticians and historians try to invent concepts through the use of design. So basically, the first answer would be theory as the invention of concepts. Then the second question would be, how is this theory organized? How is this theory legitimized? I find it interesting to look at architecture by adopting this theory that is the social nature of art, in this sense, which comes from authors and philosophers like Arthur Coleman Danto and others, who discuss the artistic world as somehow as a social group in which what they basically are saying is that the artwork is not just the product of the artist, but it's rather something that is justified as such by a series of social groups. So, for instance, in architecture, we might want to say that the value of a building as an architecture is given by a series of different institutions and subjects that somehow justify and problematize this building, this object, as something that has a value. So, for instance, in architecture would be architects, critic, the public, of course, and institution, the funding programs, which are, of course, important, theorists and universities, and somehow all together define what architecture is. Which is, again, the problem of legitimization, which is, I think, the basic problematic given by the ontologies. So, in order to look how this theory is somehow organized, I looked at three different ontologies that I think show different ways of organizing architectural knowledge. Starting in order of publication, starting from Michael Hayes, of course, we've seen it very much. What I think he's doing is somehow, as it was said before, trying to develop a history of theory, that is to say, a discourse. And we see it in the index of the volume. So we see a sort of history of architectural theory that starts with Manfredo Tafuri in 1969 and ends with Robert Somol and all the post-structuralists somehow inspired theorists in the 90s. And what it does basically is somehow developing this discourse that, referring to Jürgen Habermas, it can be defined as the pragmatic argumentation as a social practice. That is to say that according to this view, in architectural theory, in architecture, we see a sort of linear history of different arguments, one following each other, and one criticizing each other in a sort of evolution. So towards the idea, again, of progress and innovation. And this is more or less it. We see a history that goes with Manfredo Tafuri to Somol, as said, interrupted by different drawings by architects, but yet still this kind of linear development. Yes, but then if we look at the second ontology, that is the one created by Francis Malgrave, we see somehow a different way of organizing architectural theory. That is, rather than a discourse, what they define is a series of discourses. So, for instance, looking at the same period of Hayes' ontology, we see how actually, according to them, there are different discourses that would be, I think, different architectural words, one following each other. So we start with the rationalism, we go through phenomenology, then alternative strategies and debates that I think already this title shows some weaknesses in this way of thinking architectural theory. Post-structuralism and deconstructivism, finally postmodernism, regionalism, and traditionalism. So what they do is somehow the definition of these different discourses, and differently from Hayes, they also include the manifestos by architects, which is not just the drawing. So for instance, if we look at post-structuralism, we have the philosophers who somehow inspire the discourse of architecture, the theorists who define it, and the architects who, according to Margrave, are kind of embodying it in their forms. Yet, the problem today, I think it's much more complex. These are a series of screenshots I've taken from Instagram that I don't know here, but in Innsbruck is the favorite media for students to show off their work, and also architects. And I think it's interesting because somehow we see the flattening of values. So architects and students are on the same level, and we see we don't even see not even a discourse, but like we don't even see more than one discourse. We just see a chaotic mess of stuff. At the end of the day, altogether pretty boring, I would say. And this notion is actually problematic for if we look at the Margrave Anthology, in the sense that what we see is that the last chapters are called Millennial Tensions and the End of Theory and Tectonics and Geometry, and they are unable to reconstruct our overall discourse. So we have a lot of different things which don't reconstruct any homogeneity. Which I think it's a problem, of course, related to what has been defined as postmodern condition already in the late 70s. That is to say, somehow with the new media, with the new technologies, today would be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on and so forth, there is not anymore the possibility of defining our overall system, which might not be, at the end of the day, such a bad thing. But we have to look at theory and at the production of content and culture as a form of paralogy, so a sort of a argument that is logical but is almost logical, and yes and no. And I think this is somehow shown by the last of the three anthologies I've looked at, which is the one curated by Charles Jenks and Karl Kropf, in which we have a different editorial strategy. So for instance, here we have, again, different discourses: postmodern ecology, traditional, late modern, new modern, and complexity paradigm. Yet, all of these texts all of these paradigms are contemporary to each other. So for instance, in Nietzsche, if I am right, the first one is from no later than the 70s, and the latest one is from earlier than the late 90s. So it means that somehow everything is in between, which means that according to Jenks and Kropf, all of these different discourses are somehow all related to each other. They are all contemporary. Sometimes one is more fashionable than the other, sometimes another one, but yet we have this constant production of different cultural tendencies all together, which of course, knowing the work of Jenks, somehow is reflected in his way of looking at the evolution of architectural history as a sort of a successions of styles that are all contemporary with moment of weaknesses and strength. And we see how actually it's impossible somehow to reconstruct an overall discourse. And that's the main question for me and for us. How to deal with this complexity today in a way that is not trying to rationalize, as Jenks at the end of the day do with all the isms, architectural theory. So what we have proposed in our publication that is entitled Theorem is to work on the idea of somehow the paralogy as defined by Lyotard. That is to say, a sort of analyzing the speculative proposition that is behind any theoretical attempt. Yeah. What we have asked the contributors, and actually many are from here, is to analyze a text, or a canonical text of contemporary theory, so something produced after, let's say, the invention of the internet, and to somehow write a critique or a comment to this text in order to develop a sort of, let's say, dialectic between these two. And in order to look for this theorem and speculative proposition, getting rid of the discourse of deism and so on and so forth, in order to somehow produce concepts in this, let's say, chaotic mess in which we live. In order to do so, we have also asked some designers and architects to work on the graphic apparatus. That is something that, besides A's, is often forgotten by the anthologies, in the sense that, of course, architectural theory is produced in relation to architectural practice. If we look at architecture as a social world in which architects, theorists, critics work together, of course, architects, through their drawing, somehow influence the development of theories, and in this case, some have worked on Rencolas, others have taken Piranesi in a sort of a new digital way. And others, like I think Lidia Callipoliti, who has accepted our invitation, I think it's pretty important because her work somehow show more or less the intention of this publication, and I think the way we might want to look at architectural theory today. Because what she's doing, she takes the chart made by Jenks about the architectural discourses, and it kind of discretized it. And she does so by looking at the Google Analytics of the different projects and writings that can be found on the internet, and look at the importance of it, how many times they show up, and that's the size of the cross. Yep. And her intent somehow is to show how it's not possible to read a discourse. So the intention is explicitly the one of doing something that is not possible to read, and I think it works pretty well. And somehow, of course, less radically, that's the intent I think we should try to work on in architectural theory today. That is to say, I would like, in conclusion, to quote Lyotard, rather than defining new theories and like new that, post this, post that, and today we still have people who discuss about digital, post-digital, and all of these things. Probably the time has come to philosophize, as he says, in the sense to, let's say, try to deal with theory as a more speculative aspect rather than defining laws and rules. And that's my conclusion.
Well, hello, to gain some time. We are these guys there. So thank you very much for having us here. We have taken very seriously the proposition of the Congress, the call for papers, which was asking for which means to do an anthology now and then when Sylvia Lavins write her article. So we really have tried to clarify this and put it in a historical frame. We have been using the last years ago this scheme, this diagram, which cannot be considered as a theorem or can be taken very seriously, but that has proved to be a good checking box, so to say, a good tool for checking theories and place things and look how they work. This is a scheme of economical movements of boom and bust through the last half of the second century, of the 20th century, sorry. And how these economic movements produced social models that try to fit with them. And it served to see some interesting things that we have studied in other works. This was the conclusion of my master's thesis that has been published and we will present next week on Seville. And it was the methodology, an improper one, and also the basis for my thesis that we ended last summer. And well, it served to prove some things that, like, for example, how you, in a continuous growth movement, how an economic model grows and then it falls, it breaks, and how the next model was constructed with the oppositions of the first one, so that there was a co-optation was very interesting movement, at least till 68 and 71, which was the falling of Bretton Woods. But then on, co-optation didn't work anymore, and we find something like pre-corporation, which is a neologism to say that something is co-opted from birth. I mean, that certain theories was given birth to be lately co-opted to create newness from artificial opposition, so to say. So we placed over this model the main date of what Sylvia Levine and the Call for Papers were bringing to discussion and what they bring us in mind. Sylvia Levine writes, Sylvia Levine writes here, which is in the middle, it's in 1999, which is in the middle of two of these movements that we were studying. Is in between the globalization that is marked by the Berlin Fall, the fall of the Wall of Berlin and public internet, and the crisis of 2008. And this has a meaning. He was collecting all these anthologies that she collected were collecting on its way the movement that was cited by Cusset as French theory, the book that deals with the idea of how post-structuralism entered American academy, having a much vast expansion that it has on France, but becoming also politically disactivated. This led to several waves of architectural theory brought from the philosophers of post-structuralism that were giving birth to these theories. For example, it's very renowned the work of ETSAM and Derrida that led to the construction and finally the famous exhibition here, exactly in this point in this hiatus that was moved by Johnson and Wiley. Lately, ETSAM, only when Johnson died, will say or will discover the explicit political intentions of Johnson of deactivate both deconstruction and constructivism by this exhibition. So it was a certain way, again, of co-optating. ETSAM lately famously broke his relations with Derrida, or Derrida broke his relations with ETSAM by this famous letter that we all know. Like ending this first wave, like deconstruction, and closing it as already incorporated also by an article of Mary MacLeod that left it completely clear. Then on, there's another wave, which is, we can call the Deleuzian turn, as Spencer does, which has its main representative in folding architecture. That is a review published in 1993, which is again Lynn Kipnis and again ETSAM, and in which Kipnis writes an article which is called Towards a New Architecture, trying to give the new movement the importance relating to Le Corbusier, giving the same importance to this new movement. All these movements inherited from this post-structuralism second life in American academy, deactivated again, led to an intellectual unrest, which is what provoked all these anthologies that Sylvia Levine finally musealized and lead to a closure in her article. She talks about the will to historicize, the desire to historicize, but it came here to a closure. It has no continuity, and that was because there were already two waves coming from the same cooptation or pre-corporation of post-structuralism. One of them didn't become from post-structuralism, but through American capitalism, since that started on Ayn Rand, and it was a wave of individualism, which has been misunderstood as deconstructivism or even Deleuzianism, but is mainly individualism, and get his epitome in the construction of the Guggenheim in 1997. And also in 1997, there's a second wave of misinterpretation of Deleuze, which take place, as Bidler says, in a congress called Autonomy and Ideology in 1997 also, organized by Robert Sommel. What was to be misled from Deleuze this time was the concept of difference. Deleuze was a fierce anti-dialectical who defended difference as a non-dialectical way to admit diversity. This was misunderstood for the architectural world as the complete unnecessity of theory, of the elimination of theory. So, in this same point, in 1997, will be the start point, as Bidler says again, of all the post-critical movement. Both the triumph of spectacular architecture like the Guggenheim and the creation of post-criticality led to the big expansion of a spectacular architecture that we lived before, and that left completely useless or let's say musealized or closed all the anthology effort before. So much so that the next anthology that is written around 2010 deals mostly, as Sylvia said this morning, with the emptying of theory. So it's an anthology which deals with, is full of its own emptiness, so to say. It is with the exclusion of theory, since theory should be the main aim of an anthology. We find again Lavin, I don't know how to call it, Levin maybe, in this same anthology, in an article written in 2006, where she left completely the ontological effort and passed through the other side. And she said, there are no theories, but only shop talk about buildings. So she passed completely on the side of Sommel and Zaera and all the anti-critical side. And she talks about the masochism of the 70s as the opposite of the practicality and the smoothness and all these things that anti-critical, all these cool words, the coolness that anti-critical used. She talked very bad of the period of the 70s as masochism, as a period in which architecture hates itself. But then again, just a couple of years after she writes, we will come to a crisis, and all the period later on, till today, is mostly filled with kind of mimicking the 70s. In this case, I hadn't had the time to explain it so much, but the model also, since each each social model is based on the opposition of the other one, is created by the oppositional forces of the other one, there are some kind of mimicking between alternative models. So the model helps understand that what we have been doing since the crisis is, in certain ways, and with certain distances, quite similar to what happened in the 70s. So what is the sense of doing an anthology today when we are, it seems that we are in a certain similar position to this one of Levin or in 1999. We are at the end of the crisis and at the starting point of something that will come that we already don't know what it is, but will drive probably us up again. Or maybe not, but it's a possibility. We might be, I think it's interesting to know where we are in the time of proposing an anthology right now. Because we are, as Carlos will say, in the delta.
Right. Maybe our position is very well described by my friend, and we can live to discuss together. But we have some more questions to explain if we have time. I don't know. Very quickly. As the most of the participants of this Congress know and will show in the next hours, this map, this diagram is very, very well known, and I think it's necessary to explain some kind of problematic focuses related to these voids. Maybe you know this map is created by the Delphi method. It's a method in which you are consulting to experts to say what is the reality in the current times. And you decided in the committee how to describe this reality and how to draw. So Jenks in his PhD is taking 1, 2, 3, 4 till 6 concepts, leaving these voids, which are very, very, for me, interesting. As a good anthologist, the problem is when you are saying the same that you said before, but that's the method of get the legitimacy. If you are saying the same, you are you said 20 years ago, you are legitimated by yourself, your work. So this is a constant in the work. You can see here till the 2000. And voids are changing a lot, but you can recognize the same way to understand the reality. What is interesting too is how this map, this kind of map, is used by the architects under in the School of Architecture training for new architects. And in a part of Jenks has different books, not so good, but by my criteria, at the end of this last years. But one of them, very criticized, but quite interesting, he talked about the figure of a delta, joining for architecture the symptoms of the present, soft science, hard science, and at the most, the closer position is there when this kind of view and understanding and create reality is filled with the figure of a delta. All the presentations this morning and just prior to us talked about to make an image. We are going to try to show an image proposed by us, related by this one, and the map of Jenks from his PhD and evolution. The idea is to understand how the void is what, in this moment, I think Jenks is completely he's clarifying the idea to understand how reality is the form to understand how architecture can be made. And the void for the physician has a very, very interesting point just in the 70s with a physician, a Nobel Prize, Paul Dirac. Paul Dirac joined the matter and the antimatter to understand the theories from the micro to the macro, and joining explains how is our time. And the result is the reality is the debris of this encounter from the positive and the negative, the void and nothingness and everything. And every school, for example, this is the comparison between two schools in North America, Cooper Union and Columbia University. You can see with the same items you can see in the image. Everyone wants to himself to take what is important for them and say, in a genealogy, it's a very important word, how every school want to be narrative, want to be diagrammatic, to say how his own anthology present with the same notes, present a different way to understand this reality, and confront the idea of understanding what is architecture for training students. And of course, in one of the last books of Jenks, talking about postmodernism, he says, at this moment, to make an anthology would require more than 500 architects inside this diagram. And curiously, Alejandro Saera, which captured from Moneo, from Architecturas Bis, an article entitled Ya casi acabando el siglo XX, that's finished in the 20th century, in 1978. And he entitled this article as we are already in the 21st century. He decided to use, this is a Foucauldian thinker, all the terms used by Jenks in the last diagram and to put inside a new form or understand how to move. And the practice of architecture is moving there. And you can see a correspondence between the reality and the form in which architecture is moving. Aesthetic activists, material fundamentalists, constitutionalists, neutralists. It's curious. Yagami is just in the middle, in the center. It's a credit stand to the oldest point. It's a figure moving very good inside. Well, our point to finish our presentation is like to, maybe I understand, I was discussing in the lunch, discussing not, just a beginning, how a theory must be used to make a line inside it and a line to navigate inside this map, maybe, I don't know, you can see. But Saera Poro talks about the figure, psychoanalytical figure, understanding the reality is kind of a compass, because you can, in every position, all the time, moving and stopping and so on. But we decided to put both circumstances into a form of understanding. This is our last image, in which the idea of the continuum of the history is putting in a figure of a delta, as Jenks says, and this is what is important for us. Sloterdijk, in a book entitled Terrible Sons of the Modern Age, in español es Los hijos terribles de la edad moderna. At the end of the book, he expresses the idea of a delta, but not as a flow, We are not inside and decide. This time I'm more technologist, more constitutionalist, more politician, more participative. No, we are in the debris of the modernity, in which the ocean and the delta is the same thing, and in which we are not. We have not voids. So we have not alternatives. Luis was saying this morning, it's possible to understand what's actual and then what is actuality, what's in the difference. But you are saying in this point, this is there is an opportunity to understand how to put apart the idea of construct architecture. But in our point of view, it's very difficult to have an alternative nowadays. So the figure of a delta as a psychological image is something like a position to understand the problem, but not the figure. So just, well, we can leave the debate. Yes. All right. Thank you, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. I would like to start also saying that I'm very happy to be back here, invited, because I have been in this university for many years, and now I have been invited to come for this special event. That I have to be to say that I'm quite impressed, because the quality of all the interventions has been very high. And what I find really interesting is the capacity you achieve to make a very to focus the topic on something very specific, because I think that it's not normal to see a panel where all the presenters are dealing with similar attitudes, at least, and I think that's interesting. That makes it so specific, the panel, that it's a kind of a new discipline that I don't know if I'm in that expertise deep enough to go into the content that you have been researching for years. So my intervention is, at least mine, is going to be more from the outside and more methodology, from the methodology. Of course, most of the interventions have been dealing with the concept of ontology, and sometimes it has been clear, sometimes not, but there has been, well, sometimes a confusion if ontology is just collecting, or if it is a second step of classification. I think that in some of the presentations it has been more clear, but in the case that it's just a collection, then my first question would be, in your analysis of this ontology, what is the goal of the ontology? Is it a rule that you follow to get some results, or is it just an arbitrary process where you get different objects and then you discover, or you produce knowledge relating all the discoveries? And once you produce a classification, I have missed a bit the scientific explanation. Maybe in the last presentation it was more clear. But if we go into a classification, it is very important to know the rules, how to put all the elements on all the places. And those rules, if we look at it from the scientific point of view, they have to be univocal and universal. So you cannot put each object on any place. Like in this diagram of architects, I think that was clear. One architect could be only in one place according to the parameters, and each office is supposed to find a place on this universe. So there's nothing out of the diagram. I think that, just to finish, I don't want to talk very long, but that makes me think if we, how far are we going out of our discipline? So how far are we being scientific, and how far are we borrowing the knowledge from other disciplines to try to learn out of criticism or architectural design? Maybe before the answer, maybe you want to...
Yeah. Yeah. Some of the things Ignacio just said. I'm happy you brought up the thing about arbitrariness and rule, so that I don't have to mention it. Well, first of all, I'd like to say I congratulate you for your papers. I'm very surprised by the quality and by the as Ignacio said, by the focusing of your papers on the subject as proposed by the Congress. That's I'm gladly surprised by this. This is not frequent in congresses of architecture, as you know. Well, I have many particular comments, but I prefer to maybe put forward some general question or comment. I think the 4 papers that we just considered share some things, share a concern about the deep meaning of anthologies. Even if we had a case study in Giacomo Palla's case, I think they are all searching for the deep understanding of anthology as a genre. And you also agree, I think, in the problematic condition of this form. But I think you face it in 2 different ways. In the case of Tapia and Minguet, and also in Pantaleon, I think this form, this genre, is understood in a codified historical way, somehow obsolete. And you propose some ways out of this obsolescence. In the case of Pantaleon, even this obsolete condition is seen as a potential source of interest for anthologies, which is very interesting, and you didn't mention, I think, but I missed a lot of your presentation, by the way, because you were reading. So, and in the case of Minguet and Tapia, in this very Tafurian, intense way you write, I don't know if you identify yourselves with this, but I saw some overtones of this Tafurian sense of crisis and the death of theory and all that. You also, in the end of in the conclusions of your paper, you propose some alternatives. You didn't have the time to mention, so my first thing would be to ask you to explain these alternatives. And in the case of the other 2 papers, there's a different approach to anthology, in my opinion. I think you believe anthology is more like a living and evolving form. And in this evolution, you both share the idea that technology would play a role in the redefinition of anthology. In this sense, this is, for me, has been the most interesting idea. And for example, Canivari mentions how text processing technologies, including indexation and quote quantification, etc., can help us to redefine anthologies. And in the case of Palla, it is more explicitly proposed that social media can provide a new way to achieve anthology without the anthologist, somehow. I remember you put a question very precisely. Let me read it. How can a theory be legitimized or legitimized today? And you allude to the consideration of the practical resonance in our community, the practical resonance. I don't know if you really believe we can achieve this emancipation from the anthologist and the authority behind anthology through the technology. You yourself in your anthology, you choose and make the invitations without, without any open process, no? So that's a contradiction, no? And so will we use this new technology to conceal even more and even stronger authority behind the new anthologies? And so falling again into the instrumentalization of knowledge by ideological, to achieve ideological purposes? It's a comment.
Too much questions to answer. Too many, sorry. But I will try to, I don't know, to add something. Of course, anthologies are not collections, arbitrary collections. They are, as some books explicitly say, agendas. They are politically positions, and they try to find any kind of ideology, as Carlos has exposed, in the opposition of the Cooper Union and Columbia was the other one. And I think we have to keep this clear. And the possibility of getting emancipated from the anthologies, or from the authority of the anthologies, via technology, I don't think it's an emancipation of power. I think technology is another kind of power, and it's powered by someone. So it's not an escape from authority or from power or from any kind of anthologies. I've heard a lot today about these have you said, quote quantification and these ways of kind of automatically anthologize. I'm quite scared about it, sincerely, because if it was automatic, I would be scared. But I'm more scared than if it was automatic, because it's not automatic. It's led by someone who you don't see. So it's much more. It's much more fearful. And about the arbitrarity, anthologies are. You can read anthologies so much for what they say, that for what they don't say, for what they hide. As Carlos has shown also in the voids of Jenks, the voids are almost as important as the full parts, as well as in Saeras. We don't share this view, but I always have this feeling when I see the model of Saera, I have the impulse of twisting it and see how it's on the other side. Since it looks like a sphere, I would like to see what's on the other side. I will leave to Carlos the explanation of our three proposals, since he will do it much better than me.
Yes, sure. No, I totally agree on the fact that technology is not emancipation. Actually, my point would be that, I mean, the technology as every tool, as it is writing, as it is language, I would say, it is political. And there is a form of control. So for instance, like Pinterest would be an example. A few years ago, I don't know, now students are all using Pinterest, yet the algorithm behind Pinterest is driving students to just refer to the same things. But at the same time, I don't think that before we had the internet, it wasn't like that. So for instance, even Michael Hayes' Anthology is published by Columbia University in the 90s, which is Columbia University, the center of the American debate, in which people like Kipnis and so on and so forth teach, and they somehow control the discourse. So there was anyway a form of power there. What I'm saying is that probably through the existence of these different discourses, through acknowledging the existence of something that is behind or beyond the discourse. And for instance, Colomina has done, I think, a wonderful historical work looking at various fanzines in the 70s and 60s, showing something that was hidden not really shown, by the canonical way of looking at architectural theory. That's also a question I would ask you, in the sense that I would say that an ontology is historicized, and history is historicized, and it's not like talking about sugar that is not sugar, because the way we look at history today is different from the way we look at history yesterday. And I would even say, maybe, that's why I would also answer that it's not univocal, it's not universal, there is nothing scientific in our ontology. Actually, what we asked the contributors to select a paper. We didn't give a paper to them, apart 2 or 3 cases. This is a contradiction, but anyway. Because we wanted to see what was relevant among some people we knew that would have had something to say or to draw, what was something interesting going on inside this chaotic mess. And I don't remember what I was saying. Yeah, more. Yeah, yes. And yeah, it was absolutely something arbitrary. And even, the problem is, of course, we have a publisher. So he has some rules and also some economic requirements that cannot be really afforded. But for instance, I would also say that probably some would say that something from the 50s is more topical today than Carlo Ratti, for instance, or Stefano Boeri in Italy, I don't know. So would also be the past more contemporary than the present? That's another question that I think it's quite interesting. And that's also why I would be also a bit skeptical about Zaira Polo and Jenks, all this way of classifying, because there is always something that goes out the system, but at the same time you need a system in order to look at the world around you. So it's complex. My ideal proposal for an ontology probably would be something that is constantly published and republished and changes over time, but I don't know how to do it. Maybe in this sense new media could be helpful, but I don't know. That would be my answers.
Yeah, three answers. Three answers. Okay, about your answer, I would say that because I am interested in ontology as an obsolete instrument, I'm not interested in, I'm interested in how the authors or the concepts in which it is based is what I am interested on, not in how we see ontology today, because it would be long to explain, but for me, is this the way to see what is today in this interrelation between past and present. So this is why, for me, is the most interesting thing is ontology as an absolute instrument. I'm going second. So the first question was, is just a collection, ontology? From my point of view, I suppose it's because of Levin. Of course not. Because what interests me about Levin point of view, is that I realize that under this multiple appearance, and objective and fragmentary and very postmodern, in reality was the old shadow of the great story or the great theory, but in an imperceptible way. I can feel that it's a way to legitimize certain architectures today. So this is more or less what I try. Is try to see ontology as collection is to see as it really is, because to see the glass, be in front of the butterflies, not just the butterflies, but the glass that put this theory in another country in the past, just to contemplate it. I want to more or less break the glass and intersect present and past. And for the other answer, the third one, the second one, the obsolete. I say something about this. As an obsolete, of course, the arcades are the example for this power of the obsolete object. And of course, the arcade is where Benjamin go to understand his time. It's just like an archaeology of the contemporary. And because we cannot see what we are, because it's too close, we have to understand where it was born. So in this obsolescence is where we can understand this. So if the case is the place where Benjamin goes to understand his present, in this case is anthologies as an obsolete instrument is where I go to understand what is theory, architecture theory, since the 70s. And this is maybe this is the more interesting thing. I didn't have time to develop it, but because Labin, I understood that Labin thinks that anthology is not a correct instrument to show the architecture theory since 1968, because it instrumentalized this theory, no, to legitimize this architectural practice, no. But maybe it's even more, no. Maybe anthology is perfectly adequate to represent these theories, because these theories are also based in a mythological foundation. This is.
All right. I would like to answer 2 questions. The one is to say something else about anthology, and the second one is to put on the table 3 possibilities beyond anthology. First one is to say that if you remember, the anthology is a model in a very, very wide range to understand what is a modern instrument. I'd like to remember to Giulio Camillo in 1562-63, I think, in which in this year and the following ones, paid by the Spanish politician and so on, he develops what he entitled Teatro della Mente, the theater of mind. And this is very interesting because it's the reunion, the gathering of the principles of Vitruvio, making a theater as a form, architectural form, but considering every position, even of the architect as a director of the orchestra, joining the mythological and the science in the same way. Is the before A.B. Barbour is Giulio Camillo making images. So it's very interesting to go ahead with this kind of understanding how to the positions in which we decided to put the knowledge is the idea of the entire reality. And this is, for instance, to make an and the second one is to give 3 possibilities. Well, these possibilities are not in the paper. We are thinking about it this morning in the metro coming here, so it's not very, very prepared. But it's quite interesting because the first one is to continue with genealogy in the terms of Nietzsche and Foucauldian terms. A genealogy has the possibility to insert a contradiction inside. So it's very, very important to make what I was saying about the positive and the negative, and to describe the world in a different way, not in a dominion language, which is important too. Second one, specialize the knowledge. The idea of your maps, your presentations, for us, very, very interesting too, in which the idea of seeing 3 dimensions, the knowledge, has a new possibility to understand the planar, the linear, the figures, and understand a new way to. And the third one is simple, is ethics. What I mean with ethics is, with an example, Ludwig Wittgenstein tried in his difficult life to publish the idea of the Tractatus, how the language goes to reality, or at the end of his life, reality goes to the poetics of the language. It's a different one. To publish both versions in the same book, it was impossible. No one published him the idea of the reunion of an idea and his contrary. So we can understand how Wittgenstein can be the model to understand how ontology can evolve to an idea of understanding when I am saying in an important publishing house, I'm saying something more important for say this in this publishing house that what I'm saying in reality. So this is, I think, we were thinking about this morning, and I think it's a possibility to discuss with all of you. If you.
Well, I would like to take that end that you said to continue with another topic that relates with arbitrary.
Maybe we should also open the debate to the audience.
Okay, maybe. Okay.
Maybe I didn't want to interrupt you,
Okay.
but I did.
Yeah, I have a question because you have correctly assumed that ontologies are a way of legitimizing some tendencies and legitimizing a particular strand of architectural practices, and that it has to do with politics and power and ideology and so on. I can, to a very large extent, agree with that. But what I didn't hear here, and I think it's very much part and parcel of making ontologies and why people make ontologies, is also ontologies are a tool for teaching. And what about that? So is that obsolete as a tool for teaching? I think that's also something to be addressed.
In fact, this is something they all acknowledge in their papers, the necessity for ontologies. So I want to make.
So that's why we are here already, probably. If not, we will probably not be discussing ontology because it will be definitely obsolete. But it's required for teaching. And, well, you have said, Giacomo, that past could be more actual than present. For sure, that's what I was saying when I said that our present from the 2008 till now is like a constant revision of the 70s to a point which has become really disgusting. You can see so much how the similarities are coming once and again. That's all, I think. Well, the idea of the obsolete ontology has has to do with what you have said, including in the ontology what you are saying and what you are not saying at the same time. This is I think it's an extremely interesting idea, including the voids of Jenks, or including the other side of Zaira in the same publication or in the same, or at least, if not including it, being aware of its possibility and making it explicit.
For, let's say, the ontologies for teaching, yes, I think it's fundamental. Of course, like, I have now my first studio at the university where I do my PhD, and I've asked students to look for ontologies or manifestos and so on and so forth because they study somehow utopia and that. Yet, I would also recommend students to be careful when they read ontologies, in the sense that, if I'm not wrong, in Hayes' ontology there is Tafuri, but I don't remember if there is Rainer Banham, for instance, there. So probably they should also be aware of the fact that there is a discourse inside the ontology for them, because the world is big, and that's somehow, I think, both the relieving and, if we want, also the scary part about digital social media, in the sense that they show up a world that is huge, with so many differences, and on the one hand is really relieving to me, in the sense that the discourse always tend to exclude something and to somehow declare its obsolescence or stupidity, even. On the other hand, of course, we have the problem that everything is equal now. So yes, it's tricky, and probably the ontology as a tool today might be useful in that direction. Yet how to have the construction of a discourse that is at the same time open for something that is strange to its own discursive rules? That would be my question.
Well, about the ontology, I would say that we cannot talk about one ontology or the ontology, because, of course, it is a construction made by some editor to talk his vision of history. So we should at least talk about ontologies. But talking about this question, I would keep my opinion for tomorrow when I will talk about it. But I wanted to raise a couple of questions. The first one to Giacomo, because, well, today we all blame about the mechanicals behind the algorithms of platforms and technology. But I think that technology brought, if we think at what we had before social networks and information technologies, we started with magazines that in the best of the cases were monthly ones, no? Domus, Casabella, Architettura Viva, Croquis, and so on. At their best, they published 150 projects every year at their best, and most of them were repeated between the magazines, so that the vision of students and of architects that studied built architectures around the world were much more limited than today, so that at least technology brought a democratization of knowledge. Of course, there is a lot to talk about it because of these restrictions and suggestions and so on, but at least like what's happening at MIT with a global architectural history, that's something that 20 years ago was unbelievable, but to talk about something else than Western architecture. So that I think that technology is a double-headed monster that would need a lot of discussions. And the question is really is for Carlo, because I really appreciated the reinterpretation of Sairapolo compass of architecture. But with your short description of the movement of the compass and the shake of the actors, that of course is the reality, because with a so changing and transforming society, of course, it's very difficult to keep for several years the same beliefs, at least. So that what I'm afraid is that shaking this compass is like shaking a bucket, so that everything will be the same. Or could you explain it a bit deeper?
Very quickly. The question is difference, is the Lucian term. How not to be dialectical, and how to express the difference to be another one and not the same one. And the picture is very perversus. Perversus is the word in English? Yes. Form of understand how the architecture operates. For instance, Sairapolo talks about how his first diagram, collecting only 10 main well-known architects, Gehry, Miralles, and so on, put in this way, Foucauldian way, to understand how the classification could be made, and how to express the difference according to the current times, in which you cannot say that what is important to talk about the star system, but participation in social, and now it is quiet forms and so on. And Saira in that point says, I belongs to the first picture, but I understand the moment needs a different picture. So the idea of delta is the difficulty to say, as Sloterdijk says, all the negatives, all the differences, all the struggling forms of understanding the reality. This is the title of his book, The Bastards of the Modernity, Napoleon, Jesus Christ, all the without ever longing, but saying what is the present in every moment, are invoked to be in this map. But as there is the debris of the modernity, you cannot do anything with it. It's stagnated at the same time as it's moving. So it's the idea of the fail of modernity, but it's the modernity, not post-modernity. No, it's the same way, but at the end of the system. So it's very, very difficult to say something else. Well,
I would like to say that one thing about this compass by Zaira, which I think is a confusing issue, is that Zaira's compass is not cannot be labeled or addressed as an anthology, because it's a taxonomy, it's a classification, and the problem is when you classify reality and then you become Linnaeus or somebody that thought had a capacity to describe all the different kinds of animals according to their own specific qualities, is working in a completely different way than from that other person that says, okay, I'm going to put together sort of a number of, in this particular case, a number of texts that I think might be significant, because that person is, what he's saying is that I want to provide everybody with a specific cultural construction. I want to put things in and things out, of course, not in an arbitrary way. I don't know if it's a sign of power or not, but it's a sign of knowledge, because what you're providing is a cultural construction that's trying to say something very specific about the state of knowledge, or state of discipline, the state of architecture, whatever it is. As opposed to Zaira, that decided to classify everybody and decide who was a chicken and who was another kind of animal, and by empowering himself as the one that classified everybody in this sort of around the world, like this mappa mundi with all the little animals in it, it became sort of a listing God that decided where was each of us. You know, maybe we were not in the list, but we could identify ourselves within the taxonomy. So I think there are two different genres. One is the one defined by the teacher, one is the one designed by God.
Just, I agree, but except two questions. The first one, it is said by Zaira, so immediately is the same line joining with the prior anthology, so it's the same way. So you are putting in the same way, I think. And the second one is if there is not alternative to the late capitalism, if this is a supposed question, every example inside this map is put in the star system immediately. So my school has magazine in the very well rank in the position to publish and so on. The last issue was entitled the alternatives ones of the architecture of the last decades. To be published into a magazine, to be put it into a ranking. So you have not alternative to this in this way. Yeah, of course.
Can I like to answer her question about because I thought I think High Ontology is an intellectual masterpiece. I have to say, and a perfect tool for teaching purposes, of course. But I think the only thing I think it lacks is something like a warning or something that which could deal with our traditional concept of past, present, and future. That of course are abstractions we need, but are just abstractions. And the reason, because I wrote this essay as a way, as a kind of instruction manual, or maybe the opposite, coming back to the image of the thing to break the glass. No, and I'll give you an example. I had this anthology in my shelf, but I didn't read it a lot. Just 5 or 6 essays that I interested on. But when I had to write this essay, I developed like a strategy to use it. So to analyze such an overwhelming package of information, I use it 2 strategies, complementary strategies. One is like taking a little fragment, like a biopsy, to try to find the illness of, as Levin suggests, no? This is the fragment Hayes about produce a concept of history, and on the other hand, a statistical approach to the ontology. But because it's an ontology that you can get on PDF, it's very useful. You can do a selective research, looking for Benjamin, looking for all the keywords. So I realized that Benjamin was much more mentioned for the authors of the essays than Althusser. And like this is the answer for the first question. I think it's like a personal preference to choose Althusser, or at least because Hayes didn't mention Benjamin in the introduction. And I can understand this. It's like a personal preference. I didn't speak about Jameson, but it's like I asked Didi Haberman in a conference that he gave us in the CBA 1 month ago, why Jameson thinks, like a question, why Jameson thinks that Benjamin is nostalgic. No, and the answer was very nice because he said that it's like a little bit sectaric Marxism, no? That thinking in the past is like a nostalgia, but Didi Haberman said, okay, psychoanalysis is not nostalgic at all. What he is looking for is not the past but the opposite. No, is the reconstruction of the past experience to be able to achieve the present experience.
About technology. About technology. I don't see I don't understand why to see technology as a monster, in the sense that we have always used we define ourselves thanks to technology. We are not monkeys anymore because of technology, thanks to technology, I would say. And also, I remember reading this book by a philosopher from Naples, Giambattista Vico, who lived in the 17th century. And in this book that is about the methods of studying modern history, he's lamenting about the fact that the new generations, thanks to the new printing machines, they read too much, because the real philosopher is the guy who read 2 books for all his life and really understands them. While reading already 5, 10, it was too much to him. So I think it's one of those questions like, I don't know, young generations are stupid because of, I don't know, they're more ignorant or whatever that I will say about my children, my father has said about me for sure, and so on and so forth. And I don't see the problem with also, I came here to this morning with an Uber. I posted a picture on Instagram, and so on and so forth. I've even used dating apps sometimes. So it's, yeah, I don't see the problem with technology. Things change. I would just say that probably the great, let's say for a design agenda, probably the great artists are the ones who have been able to hack the medium. So for instance, James Joyce would hack the way of writing in order to produce his work. John Cage, the way of producing music. Le Corbusier and Colas, the way of producing architecture through technology. Probably we have to find ways to hack the control of these algorithms. That would say, probably is the question of today, to me at least. I'm not saying that it has to be for everyone. Yeah.
We have some coffee outside. We just continue the same, exactly the same conversation, but with the coffee in our hand.